for anyone who's just joining us now for the Flamingo Extravaganza event, welcome. My name is Erik Liang. I'm from Portland, Oregon, and I'm intern at Flamingo. Today, I'll be moderating this session with Mary Rossi and Dr. Nicola. Today, we'll be discussing how money is weaponized, what economic abuses, COVID-19, and changing the status quo. So I guess first we can, Mary or Nicola, you guys can start introducing yourselves, maybe talk about your background, experiences, and then maybe talk about how you're connected with Flamingo and how you found out about this event.
Sure. Nicola, however you prefer, I can pop in first to build the link between Flamingo. So I'm Mary. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Erik, so much for setting this up, and Flamingo for having us. And Nicola, thank you so much for jumping on with me. I'm actually very excited to be bringing an incredibly global perspective to this. I think it's really, really important. I'm Mary, I shared that before. I'm the Director of Financial Inclusion for Global Thinking Foundation US. The Global Thinking Foundation focuses on financial literacy and gender equality. And through those two things, our third core pillar is economic abuse. And Global Thinking Foundation is from Italy and then France, and now we just opened up in the US. We're a little startup foundation here. We're getting our sea legs, if you will. And so we're just building curriculum and our first programs here. And I am familiar with Flamingo through Scott. We met through a series of hilarious events, as it always goes. Flamingo also does financial literacy, so we had so much to talk about. And our demographics were right next to each other. So we were talking about high schoolers and college kids and kids right out of university, and we just had a great time with it. And so that's our connection with Flamingo. And then just to share a really short nutshelled version of my life, because it's been a whirlwind. I have an extremely varied background doing all sorts of crazy things. I studied at 7 universities in 3 countries. I don't recommend it if you ever actually want to get your bachelor's. You will be in school forever. So it's fun, but maybe don't do it. I've been in the military, I've been a paramedic, I've been an English teacher, I've done all sorts of crazy things. And about 2 years ago, the founder of Global Thinking Foundation, who's a dear friend, she picked me up in New York, and she was like, hey, I know you're working on a completely different goal that you've got, but there's this foundation I have, and I want to open it up in the US. Do you want to help me open it up? And I said, sure. And as she told me more about it and this focus on economic abuse and financial literacy, it really resonated with me, because I grew up surrounded by violence and economic abuse. And when you're young, you don't really realize that those things they're not supposed to be normal. You don't really realize that they're bad. And while I was trusted with incredible financial freedoms, by the time I was 12, I grew up in an environment where economic abuse was something that I didn't recognize. And as an adult, I want to bring so much awareness around it. So needless to say, in short, I'm nutshelling it and packing it really tight, but in very short, I fell madly in love with the mission and stuck with global thinking. And this is now my core intention and purpose in life, is to talk about this and share this. So I apologize. I know that wasn't quite as nutshelled as I'd hoped, but Nicola, I'm going to pass it right off to you.
Hi, well, lovely to meet you virtually, Mary, and thanks very much, Erik, for facilitating this session. So I'm Nicola Sharp. I'm the Chief Executive of a charity called Surviving Economic Abuse here in the UK. I think my screen's slightly darker than everyone because it is gone 11 o'clock at night. So I'm staying up a little bit past my bedtime this evening, but I've been listening into some of the sessions today and it's been really interesting. So a bit of a potted history for myself. Started working in the violence against women and girls sector back in 2006 and worked for a domestic abuse service provider, spent a lot of time through my role, which was policy and parliamentary affairs, speaking to victims and survivors, and was always struck really by the economic difficulties that they faced. So in absolute awe of survivors who'd often fled their homes with absolutely nothing, and who really were just facing quite an insecure future, and quite often, as is the case with economic abuse, were continuing to experience that form of abuse post-separation as well. And I think the moment for me and what ignited my passion in this work was that, you know, some of the survivors who I was speaking to reflected myself. They were well educated, they were bright people. As far as I was concerned, if they hadn't had the misfortune to meet the person who abused them, they would have been doing amazing things. And it felt like their life was a little bit on hold, and then it was going to take them a lot longer to do what it was that they were, to sound a little bit twee, put on this earth to do. And I think at that moment, I just felt such a sense of unfairness and unjustness, that I thought, you know, this is actually something that I need to understand more about. And back then, there was very little information about economic abuse. It was in everybody's experience that I spoke to, but when you looked in research or you looked at practice responses, there was very little there at all. And I spent a couple of years after that actually doing research and speaking to victims and survivors and doing some academic work in this area in the UK. Became very interested actually in the work in the US. So Adrian Adams at Michigan State University, Jodie Posmus, who was at Rutgers University, but I understand he's moving on somewhere else now, you know, have really kind of led the way. And I've been looking from the UK across to the US and also to Australia, where there's been some fantastic practice. And then back in 2016, I was lucky enough to be awarded a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship, which enabled me to visit the US and Australia to really learn about practice responses and to see what was happening in the policy context. And I think for me, that was my moment where I'd spent a long time in the UK waiting for someone to come and do something around economic abuse. But once I'd witnessed what was happening in those countries, I thought, right, you know, women in the UK need these same responses. So I came back and in early 2017, set up the charity Surviving Economic Abuse. So we're 3 years old next week. And our mission is really, really simple. It is to raise awareness of this form of abuse and also to ensure that we transform the response to it.
That's really incredible. Sorry, I just like, I don't know how many people in here know about that award, but I was like, you said it and I was like, oh my God, that's awesome and incredible. And somebody has to say that. So I know it's 3 years ago, but congratulations, that's incredible. Erik, I don't know if we were able to get it to work or not, but we've got a couple of polls because I know there's people listening, but we've just been talking at you. And as far as I can tell, most of this is just going to be us talking at you. So we wanted to give a little bit of an interactive piece to it. So I'm hoping everybody can see the slideshow. And so we're just gonna do a fun icebreaker poll to see if we can get it to work and like all of that good stuff. So it's just a fun icebreaker, like nobody worry about the answer you're giving, it's just for fun. So we can go on to the next one so that they can get the instructions and see what to do. So you guys are going to text in, if we can, I don't know. Yes, okay. So you can grab an iPad, your phone, open a web browser, your brother's Android. I don't know, just like grab a device that you can get on the internet with. And everyone's going to know my name. It's going to be super great. But you can text or you can click. I'm sorry, not click. You can type in the web address, and we're going to see if we can get some live polling from everybody. So I know that we can't see you, so we're not sure how people are doing, but we're going to click on to the next one and see if people are able to send in their polls. So what you guys can do, and it's at the top, and this is again just for fun, but if you had to invest 60% of your money in one current music icon, who would it be? And what you can do is just text a number. So let's see if we can get this to work before we get on to other stuff. We got Beyonce. I gotta get in there with, okay. See, I'm not sure if it's working. Hey. Oh, this is fantastic. I strongly approve of the Beyonce. I'm just saying, like, she's a great person to invest in. I'm pretty sure she and her husband have like got the money stuff figured out. Okay, well, I don't want to sit too long on each one. So we're going to go on to the next poll. So I hope everybody feels really confident. You're just literally texting letters. So wow, Beyonce is like really killing it, which is understandable. So the next poll is just so that we can get to know you guys a little bit. We shared a lot about ourselves and like where we are and our backgrounds. And so we want to ask just like 2 little questions about you guys. So Erik, we can go on to the next one, which is just asking where you are right now. And I know I couldn't get everybody. I'm sorry. If I put every country on there, it would have been really aggressive and we just would have run out of a lot of space. So sorry about that. I'm just going to give a couple of seconds. Oh, now I feel terrible. There's so many others. Oh, I'm just the worst. All right, so we're gonna go on to the next one. And this one is just telling us who you are and what you do, just so that we can get an idea. So obviously I'm going to pop in and say I'm nonprofit because like, hi. I think we're gonna have a lot of students. I'm not sure. Oh, I love it. We've got so many entrepreneurs. I feel like there's a lot of students that are like, I'm an entrepreneur, and they're just like hitting entrepreneur. Awesome. Okay, so we've only got 2 more. So don't worry, you're not going to have to text too many more letters. The next question is around COVID-19. So share with us here, and again, you'll just text a letter, but what it is that you specifically are worried about during this time. So like, of course, our parents are worried about something, the government, our country, all that, but like, what about you specifically are you worried about during this time? Oh, wow, I love that everybody wants to take care of their loved one. That makes me really happy. Okay, so we've only got 1 more, last one, and then we're gonna talk at you for a while. So thank you for bearing with us. But this last one is, when you hear this term, controlling money, which of these is the closest to the first thing that you think of? Obviously, it's not gonna be exact, but like, we can get close. All right, and I'm not sure if we have any more coming in, but thank you guys for sharing those. And we just wanted to get a little bit from you guys, because like, we can't see you, and we're talking so much. And if you've been on here for most of the day, you've been hearing us talk all day. So thank you for sharing those. And I really want to I really want us to jump into economic abuse and talk about it, because I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with that term, and some of you might be completely unfamiliar. You're like, why are we talking about this? This is like financial literacy. So economic abuse is controlling money in a way, and we're going to get into the different terms, but when we talk about controlling money, it can take so many different forms. It can be subversive, it can be overt, it can be manipulative, it can be obvious, it can truly be anybody. It's almost always a partner, but it could be a loved one, something like that. But in effect, when your money is controlled and it's out of your grasp, it can easily and often is weaponized against you. And so potentially, if anybody here is familiar with this, you've probably heard the term financial abuse. That's the term that's used a lot in the US. And financial abuse really focuses on controlling access and use of finances and financial instruments. But we're really going to talk about economic abuse, because economic abuse incorporates those financial pieces, but also the life necessities and resources that come with those. So things like mortgages and cars and car payments and things like that, because it's important, like you have to have those things, and they come right along with your finances and your money. So we're going to talk about those a little bit. And I wanted to share, so we break down economic abuse for our foundation into three categories, and I think they're actually really similar to surviving economic abuse, because I remember Claudia came back and she was like, but they're almost exactly the same. And so we talk about these expressions where you can have versions of economic abuse where it's really controlling behavior, and then behavior that's really limiting, and then the biggest one that I think is different is we have paralyzing, so the behavior that like paralyzes. And so those are the three different types of economic abuse that we reference, and it really is about behavior. So if somebody is controlling behavior or limiting a control that they had, or when you get to paralyzing, it's actually taking your money, whether or not you have access to it, and using it against you to paralyze you in the position that you're in. So really quick, Nicola, I think it's almost the same for you guys. You break it down in a very similar way, and you identify it very similarly, I think.
Well, we do. We focus mainly on those who experience economic abuse in an intimate partner relationship, and that will be in the context of coercive and controlling behaviour more broadly. So highly unlikely that economic abuse will be happening in isolation, most likely alongside emotional abuse and usually physical and sexual violence, but all the while as part of a wider controlling context where someone might be isolated, intimidated, have their children used against them, and made to feel worthless. So we think of economic abuse actually as something which underpins physical safety, because I think, as you were saying, Mary, to have access to financial and economic resources means that you have what you need in order to kind of make decisions and to do what you want. So we know, at least in the UK, that the main barrier to leaving someone who's abusive is not having the economic resources to do so. So perhaps not having the money to buy a bus or a train ticket, to put petrol in your car, not having any money to afford accommodation overnight. And that means that a lot of victims stay in situations which they know are abusive for longer than they want to, purely because they can't leave. So inevitably, they're going to experience more harm as a consequence of that. So we see economic abuse is all about control, but we do see different tactics that sit under that control, mostly, and I think this is what chimes with your experience, Mary, in relation to restriction. So controlling access, ability to acquire economic resources, and then restricting the ability to actually use those things. So perhaps the car keys are hidden so you can't get in your car. Perhaps the alarm clock is turned off in the morning so you can't get to work. So lots of things to kind of stop you accessing and using the resources that you do have. And then the other thing that we talk about is exploitation. So where someone might have lots of money, but the perpetrator will do things like take out debt, generate costs, damage or steal property, and create an instability. So whether that's control or instability, the outcome is the same in terms of those limited choices and the difficulty in being able to be safe as a consequence of that.
Yeah, I love that. And I especially love what you were saying, because we call economic abuse like an indicator, like it can come before a lot of other types of abuse. But I really loved what you were saying there, that like it can come before, sure, but it can be all mixed in. It can come before, it can come after the whole relationship altogether. So economic abuse can just really go throughout. I think about a lot of statistics, especially from Victoria and Australia. I love that you mentioned them because they've just done some incredible stuff. But when we think about some statistics from them, they've been able to actually measure to a degree economic abuse. And just like you were saying, when they spoke to a lot of these victims over a 1 year period, 90% of them said that economic abuse was a part of whatever they were going through. And so I really love that you highlighted that. But I really want to jump into like the COVID-19 and the situation that we're in now, and the importance of economic abuse, and talking about this now, and why it's so important with everything that's going on. And we're gonna talk about like jobs and stuff, so I love that you mentioned that as well. So I think one of the reason that it's so important to highlight economic abuse during these times right now, so it's been going on before, it's going to go on after. We want to end it as fast as we can, but one of the reasons I think we need to highlight it so much right now is because economic abuse is absolutely rampant because of the economic situation that most countries are in. And of course, I'm going to speak from the US perspective and give some US stats and stuff, but this is a global issue. There are countries across the globe that are suffering more or less, but because of the economic situation, economic abuse is just rampant. But in addition to that, there's also this humanitarian situation where these human beings are being incredibly human, and they are stepping up and they are standing up for others. They are raising their voices about things like this. They're raising their voices about changes that really need to be made that maybe weren't obvious before. And so I think it's so important to talk about this now, because we have this opportunity to actually really create change, and even more change on the things that we've already done, because we have this conversation that's being so highlighted. So within COVID-19, some of the things that I really wanted to jump in and talk about were jobs and unemployment, and like skilling up and how that relates to like financial literacy, and also just like this constrained access to resources and how that has really changed under COVID-19. So just bringing the US perspective and talking about jobs and why this really matters right now in economic abuse. And then I really actually am so excited to hear the UK side of this, because the US social systems are just so, they're so much weaker and so different. But jobs in the US, like everybody knows, the unemployment situation is just absolutely terrible in the US, worse than the Great Depression, and all of these things. But when it comes to economic abuse, the majority of the victims of this are going to be women. And if they're not women, the next most common group of people are people from the LGBTQ+ community. And so the reason I highlight this is because when we talk about unemployment, it really affects these groups of people. So like when we're talking about unemployment in the US, it's particularly important for women. So for example, in the US, we're looking at a 16-ish% unemployment for women, and that's higher than men. The last time it was that high was in 1948. And so women in the US are unemployed at a higher percentage. And then on top of that, because of the work that a lot of women do in the US, so think work that often doesn't come with benefits in the US, so perhaps like waitresses or baristas or childcare work, like or like cleaning work, that sort of thing. So when you have women in these industries, on top of this unemployment within the industry, the percentage of women of the workforce might be lower than men, but the percent of people that are out of work is higher for women. So for example, in the US, if you're a retail worker, less than 50% of the industry is women, but more than 60% of the people that are unemployed from that industry are women. So it's higher than what they represent. And so I think it's really important to talk a little bit here about job loss and what that does and what that creates at the home, and how that really can be, whether it's manipulation or overt, how that can really walk right into economic abuse, and how our current situation is really creating a space for that to just run and those numbers to grow even more than they were before. So that's kind of the US case. And Nicola, before we go into like the nitty gritty of it, do you want to share a little bit about the UK case?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was very similar. I think obviously abuse is about power and the misuse of power, and those people who have less power are more likely to be abused. So if you have any kind of inequality, be that economic, or perhaps you might be disabled, or as you say, you might have a different sexuality, sometimes these things are used against you by the abuser. So the economic uncertainty at the moment means that, as you say, generally women are most likely to be impacted by this, and that's because they're in low paid work anyway, have a lot of childcare responsibility, are in more precarious industries, and so they've been hit hardest because of the COVID-19 virus. But then just thinking sort of generally, you know, they'll be at home at the moment, at least in the UK, we've been asked to stay at home. So therefore they are very isolated. And again, that's one of the tactics that abusers will use. So we are hearing very much how, you know, our measures to protect everybody are actually leading some people to be at increased risk of domestic abuse at the moment. So we're hearing, you know, really awful stories of a lot of victims and survivors actually going to hospital with lots more head and facial injuries, because generally an abuser wouldn't target or be physically violent and hit someone's where it will be seen, because generally a victim will be out and about. And so this kind of ability to do what you want behind closed doors at the moment is absolutely been taken advantage of. And we run a financial service line for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. And within a week of the kind of lockdown measures being put in place, we were getting 65% more calls. Victims and survivors were really worried, as you're saying, Mary, about their employment, about losing their job. They were really worried about what they were going to do for income going forward. We are very lucky in the UK. We do have a welfare benefit system for everybody. We have a furlough scheme. People are receiving 80% of their pay if they're still in their job. They're able to claim a benefit, which is called universal credit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can actually do that, because if the abuser is stopping them from applying for that benefit or is stopping them from engaging with their employer, then they're in a really precarious situation. And even those who are working at home at the moment, part of economic abuse, as we said, is about controlling access to all economic resources. So they might have had their mobile phone taken away from them, they might have had their laptop taken, the perpetrator might be refusing to take part in looking after the children, for example. So a lot of victims and survivors that we're aware of in a really precarious situation at the moment. They might have had money put aside because that was the money they were going to use to flee, which now they've had to use. They might have had to go into their overdraft facility. They might have had to start using their credit cards. We know a lot of abusers similarly are being very demanding at the moment and saying that they want you know, bicycles for the exercise that they are able to take, that they want computer games and other activities to take away the boredom, and are insisting, even if they've lost their job or their partner's lost their job, that their standard of living doesn't change. So we're really concerned in relation to employment, but also in relation to the amount of debt that a lot of victims and survivors we know are being coerced into taking out at the moment, and that economic instability that's going to create when lockdown comes to an end, and we start to move out of this kind of social isolation, and when people are able to again flee and access the support that is available.
Yeah, I that was fantastic and completely comprehensive. And I think so absolutely yes to all of that. And the only thing I'll add in there is that I think when we're all like confined at home in this way, especially when it comes to economic abuse, it just opens up the door for that first level of it as well so much. So whether it's the manipulation of it, or it's just like the very beginning stages of it. Like that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this so much here, is because these aren't necessarily things that we're like, oh yeah, you can take care of the finances. Like I've got 1,000 other things to worry about right now. And that can absolutely be in like a good-hearted way, but also these like very beginning layers of it can start to be laid down during this time. And so I loved everything that you highlighted, and I couldn't add anything more to it.
I mean, I think you're right, Mary. I think, you know, this is really insidious, and often it is presented as caring. But in this context, a lot of abusers might be saying things like, you know, can we really afford this? People are really cutting back. You know, should we be buying these basic necessities? Should you be doing X, Y, and Z? So they'll absolutely be using this context, which might seem quite caring, or it might be done very subtly, so that victims and survivors aren't realising what's happening, so that they're just taking advantage of this, you know, what we call a conducive context at the moment. And as you say, Mary, you know, society generally does still think about domestic abuse as being physical abuse. So we do know that economic and emotional abuse, as you say, are likely to be those first warning signs. And actually, if we can be aware of this now and recognise it, then sometimes we can stop abuse kind of escalating to the point of homicide. I mean, I don't know what your stats are like in the US, but in the UK, generally 2 women a week are killed and 1 man every 3 weeks by a current or former partner. And we've seen that go up during lockdown as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, globally, it's as you were saying, it's gone up across the board. The statistics of people, just like you were saying, to your hotline that are calling in across the world is just, it's gone up exponentially. And I remember when I was reading that, like, even countries like France and Germany, like places that we would think like, oh, they've got social systems, they've got it right, like even their call-ins to these hotlines has just gone up exponentially. And when we talk about stats in the US, what I think is so important is that in the US, we don't currently break down into partner violence, homicides, or any kind of abuse cases there. It's really just all under this big umbrella. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk about this now, because who are the people who are going to be making that change, whether it's cultural or legal, it's the people here, the people who are going to care about this tomorrow. So like in the US, it's just under this big umbrella. And so we have these crazy numbers, but we don't have much beyond just like this one really big diagnosis, if you will, for the whole thing. And so I think that that's a really important element to highlight. But something you were saying that I think actually goes into bringing in a little bit of financial literacy into this. When we think about women who are trying to get out of these situations, whether it's economic abuse or into partner violence of many different forms, when we think about that, they definitely try to skill up or relearn, or they try to get their skill back to where it was before. Because when a lot of women are confined at home, and again, I reference women just because it's the largest category, when they're confined and they don't have access to these skills, they lose their ability to re-enter the workforce. And one of the reasons that I thought that was so important right now during COVID-19 is because when we talk about financial literacy, that's one of the best ways to help women in these situations, is to share just like the basics of finances and what economic abuse looks like. But currently, because of COVID-19, you can't go out to a community center, or you can't go to a co-working space to go and take this course. You actually can't even watch it on your laptop if somebody's at home with you, and they can easily just pass by and see what you're working on. And I thought that was really important to highlight, because we've been sharing so much in a very positive way that we have the ability to all be connected online here. And as we were sharing, or as a panel was talking about, I thought, well, there's actually a lot of people that can't do that. They can't access a lot of their resources online. They can't go and listen to courses. They can't jump onto financial literacy seminar just because there's somebody in the home, because they're confined with them. And it takes the skill that women might be able to access in these situations, and it keeps it where it was, or further down, depending on the situation and where they are. And so that was just like, when we talk about skilling and jobs and like coming back into it, I thought that was really important to highlight. So I think the last thing to jump in here, and I'm being mindful of time, is these constrained access to resources. And we've been kind of alluding to it and talking to it throughout, but especially during COVID-19, when it comes to economic abuse, there's having restrictions to these resources is even more severe, and the repercussions are even more significant. And just to offer a kind of a reference point, for anybody listening, if you can't get in a car because, as Nicola was showing, like they hide your keys, or you don't necessarily need to, they've convinced you that you don't need to go out that day, or however the circumstance works out. If you can't get to your car and you can't go to a bank, or you can't go and get access to an ATM or something like this, your access to financial resources is lowered, and all of the other resources as well. And so in the US, what I think is really important to highlight, and then I also want to hear the global side of it as well, is that talking about this restriction to resources, a lot of the people that aren't able to go out to banks, or a lot of the people that aren't able to go in and ask for a change of their PIN because they didn't change the PIN, the partner did or someone else did. A lot of these people are lower income workers, and in the United States, they will often, when they can't do this, turn to other types of lending and other types of loans, and most of them are predatory lending of some kind. And most people here are probably familiar with payday lending. And what that leads to is, so you're already in this abusive situation, and now you're putting yourself into a cycle of debt because this is the only money that you do have access to. And in the United States right now, during COVID-19, this is becoming a big issue for low income workers. And because most of the victims of violence that we're talking about are women, it's a lot of women that are low income workers. And so that's kind of the US case of just like an extreme there. Are you seeing something similar in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think just generally those who experience economic abuse and don't have access to resources anyway will be struggling. And again, the context has made things harder. So family and friends who might have been able to support before, had a spare room, been able to lend them some money, that's really difficult at the moment. And as you say, those usual routes to support. So similarly, we know a lot of victims and survivors who fled just before COVID happened, and who might have been in control of their finances for the first time, but all of a sudden they're having to do that banking online now, and they can't go into a bank branch and get the support that they need. So there are particular challenges at the moment. But also I think the really important thing here is in relation to the fact that abusers will try and drain or diminish resources across the board. So not only economic, but also emotional, so self-worth, self-confidence, self-esteem. So even those who were perfectly able to manage their finances and other resources before meeting the abuser are led to believe that they're useless and they can't do that anymore. So quite often it might not be around financial capability, it might be around confidence building and just having support socially as well. I would say things are slightly different in the UK in that we've got quite a focus on domestic abuse generally. We have a domestic abuse bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. And also it has been recognised as what the government is calling a hidden harm during COVID. So a lot of money has been made available to charities. At least £750 million has been given to frontline domestic abuse charities because there's a recognition of this increased control that abusers have and the difficulty that victims and survivors will be having to access safety at the moment. So that's been a really important thing. But similarly, a lot of our banks and I don't know if you have building societies, a little bit like kind of cooperatives, so they're owned by the people, and they have all signed up to a code of practice. So we have a membership organisation called UK Finance, and we have a code of practice around financial abuse and certain principles that banks and building societies do respond to in relation to domestic abuse. So that's training to recognise it, to make decisions outside of policy when there is a victim who perhaps wants to have their name taken off a joint account or a home loan or something like that. And that's part of our kind of customer vulnerability piece. So actually a lot of victims and survivors at the minute who won't be able to call our National Domestic Abuse Helpline because, as you say, Mary, there'll be people in the home where that makes that very, very difficult, actually, because of some of the financial easements that are being put in place by financial institutions at the moment. To call your bank or your building society actually arouses less suspicion, but actually banks and building societies are probably best placed than they've ever been to be able to respond to this issue. So that provides a potential space now, and going forward, you know, just thinking about different stakeholders and different routes to support, and thinking about different ways in how we can support victims and survivors, not only now but going forward.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important to highlight.
Sorry to, because we only have like 6 minutes left, so I'm sorry if I just cut you off, but I know there's some questions in the chat right now, and so from Bob Gillingham, so he asks, why do you think the media hasn't made a bigger deal of the increase in domestic abuse due to COVID-19?
I think it's going to be really different between the two of us, which I think is going to be a really great perspective because, Bob, to answer your question for the US side, it's actually known that whenever there is any kind of disaster, Hurricane Harvey was a big one that they talked about. So anytime there's a disaster, they know that domestic abuse cases, reports, and calls into hotlines go way up. And I'm in New York currently, and this is the only place that I'm aware of, this might be different, but this is the only place that I'm aware of that added economic abuse and other types of abuse to the umbrella of domestic abuse in the New York State legal code. So until 2 months ago, it was just domestic abuse. And so not even having the designations, not even being able to talk about it in a specific way makes it really hard to go to the New York State, I don't know, city council or center, wherever you want to go and say, hey, we want to talk to people about this. When at the governmental level in the US and a lot of places, it's just this one big blanket umbrella term. And just to highlight that changed 2 months ago in New York. It changed 3 years ago in Australia, just to give a little bit of perspective there. So like I can answer that side of it. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear the difference.
I mean, I'd seen Bob's question, so I was kind of alluding to how high domestic abuse is on the political agenda in the UK at the moment. But just to flag our domestic abuse bill, through the work of surviving economic abuse, does introduce a statutory definition of domestic abuse for the first time, and that includes economic abuse. So as Mary is saying, you know, this is something that we can now name. We have a framework. It raises awareness of this form of abuse. It creates a focus on making sure that we can respond to it, but also it really makes sure that we can hold perpetrators accountable, which is also really important as well. I think just kind of the other thing to say in relation to that is that it's a really empowering thing for victims and survivors as well. It's what we found, again, as a charity, is that previously economic abuse wasn't recognised by victims and survivors because it was so subtle, because is there the right way of managing joint finances? What's normal, what should you expect, what should you not? And so to talk about this issue also means that people can kind of recognise when something's not quite right as well. And actually there's something really powerful about naming it, which means therefore, that pressure, certainly as the bill's going through Parliament in the UK, is then put onto our kind of local elected representatives, our MPs. And so government also has to respond in that way as well. So I think it's kind of that important kind of having the policy framework, but also, an awareness in the general public that something needs to be done in relation to this issue.
And Erik, I'm watching really closely on the time, but I have to add on to what Nicola was just sharing.
It's perfect, fine.
I loved what she was saying, and it comes right back to Bob's question, in that, so she's saying like it comes to awareness and policy put together, and Nicola will be very familiar with this, but in Australia, the community organisations came together because there was awareness with the government and helped write the codes that they have, and subsequently those codes are very, very thorough, and they actually really apply to people. And of course it's never going to be perfect, but it's actually a really great step, because the awareness was in the community and these organizations came together to write this second iteration for Australia. And so like I just wanted to share that because it was so perfect, and coming back to Bob, I had to.
All right, well, we have 1 minute left, so I just guess, we can't really do anything else, but I just want to say thank you for sharing your guys' stories. It's really inspirational. Like, you guys have been talking a lot. You guys are very knowledgeable in this field. I feel like it's like not very often talked about in the media. And so I'm really glad that you guys could expose and shine more light on this topic.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks again for facilitating. Lovely to meet you, Mary. Lovely to meet everyone.
Yes.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
This evening. Thank you. Well, wait, now it's morning for you.
It's kind of Saturday for me now.
In case anyone was
having you both.
Yeah. Well, Nicola's the trooper. She's here at 11:49 her time. So thank you. That is awesome. Thank you.
Thanks again for the invite.
Mm-hmm.